Hello, everyone. Welcome to the, I should say October 11th because that's where it is where I am, but let's call it the October 10th edition of the Scientific Governance and Risk meeting. My name is Richard Brown. I am the head of community development at MakerDAO. We have a special guest today. Rune Christensen will be joining us. We're going to talk about a recent announcement some of our closer fans may have noticed in crypto Twitter in the last 24 hours. We're going to have a little slideshow. We're going to talk about what those slides have in store for us and what the implications are for the future of MakerDAO. This is going to be a big one for us. After that, we'll talk a bit about the PEG with Vishesh, and then have a general Q&A session. So I don't want to waste too much time with the general preambles, but I will do it a condensed version. We are intensely interested in getting as much interaction with the community as we possibly can in these calls. So please, if you have a question, we want to hear them. Type it in the chat on the side. As opportunities arise, we will read those questions out for you. If you have access to a microphone, please feel free to pipe up directly and let us know what you're thinking. But I'm going to hand it over directly, actually. So Rune, why don't you take it away for us and let us know what you've been up to recently.
All right. So as you heard, we are ready to launch multi-collateral DAI on November 18. And that's why, all of us ended up being up this late until 1 a.m. because obviously we want to also share as much as possible this information with the governance community, immediately following the announcement we made here at DEF CON, just so, so you can all really start internalizing what that really means from a governance perspective, since that's, it's a little bit more than a month. So it's exciting, and of course also means that there's a lot of things we need to get ready. But also I'll just talk in general about not just obviously we'll talk about, now it's coming and what that specifically includes, but also what it really enables and what the launch of MCD really means for DeFi in general, as it really opens up for the full scope of all the cool features that were always meant to be done with Maker. So let me just try to share my screen here. There. Yeah, there. So this is actually a different version of the slides than what I used at DEF CON. That's because at DEF CON we were only allowed to use their own preset type of what do you call it, preset type of slides. So this is with our own design, which is actually looks way better than what we had at DEF CON. So that's also pretty cool. But so I'm gonna be going through sort of the content of the presentation, but in a much more casual format, and then I'm gonna pause and constantly look at have a look at chat, see if there's any specific questions, so that we can just sort of get a little bit deeper into this. And the talk I did was really about DeFi in general, but of course now we can just focus a little bit more sort of what it specifically means for Maker. Okay, so the first thing that's really important to do is, of course, just take a step back and think about what the point of everything we're doing is, right? And Maker and DeFi is one of the core characteristics is that it has this permissionless and also transparent and decentralized aspect to it, right? That means that inherently it deals with issues like financial inclusion and the unbanked being, being the victim essentially of rampant inequality, and how with Maker and with DeFi, what we're doing is we're building a better system, and then we are really allowing everyone to leapfrog into it, because there's this equal access for everyone. And that is just, a really important fact of the whole thing, because it's not just like that. I mean, it's really important in terms of like the motivation that individuals have to be, have, so that they can be a part of it. But it's also actually a crucial factor, even as it plays into to governance of the system, because there has to be that element of when you're managing and when you're governing Maker, there is like a greater purpose to it than just like maximizing your MKR returns, because the whole point is we need to get past something like the financial crisis, right? And the fact that Maker fundamentally is built as a financial system that isn't just meant to benefit exactly those that have whatever the authority over it, right? Or like the privileged access. That's something that if we can maintain that in the entire sort of culture of the governance, that really helps us ultimately always keep the eye on like the long-term goal, right? And make sure that we don't fall into the trap of chasing some short-term risky profits, and through that actually putting the survival of the system at stake. And so this is, what's so cool about DeFi, right? Composability. The fact that we've already reached a point where Maker is so successful today because there's all this cool stuff that's been built on top of it. And especially what I like to highlight is if you go sort of a little bit down or up or whatever you want to call it in the layers, you get to something like InstaDApp, right? Which is really showcasing that you can take DeFi protocols and you can put them together into a single system, and then you're providing tremendous value because you're unlocking the synergy in a very easy to use form. And as you might know, InstaDApp was recently funded by some of the top funds, even though this is just like a bunch of, it's like some young people from India that had nothing other than the fact that they could access DeFi. And also, as you might have seen in the foundation's announcement, the foundation is launching a new version of Oasis that's actually taking the same approach of trying to bundle in all the, the CDPs, but also like the decentralized exchange, like all these different functionalities into a single front end that's then optimized for easy usage, so that we can make DeFi a little bit less complex and a little bit less about having tons of tabs open at the same time and like moving between them, but then instead just like easier access to the synergy between protocols. And then finally, what's starting to get really cool is of course, the fact that there's also starting to be this crossover between DeFi and the real world, right? And Maker is already seeing this in like lots of on and off ramps and something like Coinbase, meaning that there really is this like high level of liquidity into the fiat currency and the traditional financial system. But also, for instance, the crypto debit cards that support DAI that are pretty cool in that you see the sort of the composability of DeFi actually like reach into the real world when, that means that you can sort of turn a crypto debit card into a kind of a crypto collateralized credit card, right? And spend funds that you generate out of DeFi. Okay, let me just have a look. I guess I'll have to go out of the full screen. Make sure, just check to see. Okay, I can't figure out how to check the chat. I have no idea how it works. Oh, there, okay, chat, there we go. Okay, so I'm just gonna check the chat occasionally and really, if there's something specific you want to discuss, this is how it relates to Maker governance in terms of these like high-level topics, and just type it in.
All right, Rune, I'll interrupt you if there's something relevant and read it out, or invite some.
All right. Yeah, that sounds good. That's a good idea. Okay. How do I get back in? But then, so the big challenge is crossing the chasm, right? So now all this stuff works, and we have composability, we have a sprawling ecosystem, but then now we need to just like scale from a couple of millions to, billions and billions in DAI supply. And that's a really, that's a tough task, obviously. In fact, that's the hardest part of anything we've done so far. But there are, there's like basically two major things that are coming to DeFi in general, but then also are going to be available for Maker to utilize. That I really think is like the basis for how we do decisively cross the chasm with Maker and then DeFi as a whole. So then for ease of understanding, we ended up calling them quantum leaps, it's like just the major trends, right? And composability is kind of the first one, right? It's like the really big, like the, oh, how on earth did I go back? Okay, that doesn't, whatever. Anyway, the composability is talked about that is obviously like one of the really big kind of like value unlocks where you really see a lot of things coming together and a lot of value being created out of blockchain, where it's not just speculation, but really there's some real cool value creation happening. And then getting tokenized real world assets onto the blockchain is kind of like the next really huge thing, because this is how we achieve scalability on the supply side, right? And we all know in sort of the deep governance community of Maker that this is how we've always realized that you can't just like keep, pumping credit into ETH and expect that to be the basis of a solid monetary system, even as it scales to serve the entire world. But this is like this is a big deal. There's a lot of people that are quite shocked by this, right? And really doubt it can even be done, but also just like, I mean, of course, it's only when you really realize that this is where things are going that you fully appreciate just how of a massive impact that DeFi and blockchain will have on the real world, right? Because also, obviously, once we begin to really like assimilate the traditional system and get all the tokens into Ethereum and into DeFi, then we'll quickly see like the banks and the financial institutions actually then essentially adopt the technology into their own cores and become kind of like these service-based shells around DeFi protocols, because it's just so much more efficient, right? Especially when you think about that we can combine this tokenization then with the composability again, right? And really just create a whole new level of efficiency. And then it's really important to talk about the R word, as we like to call it nowadays, because if you want to, reliably have real world assets as collateral in Maker, for instance, you need to really have total understanding and a complete grasp of the regulatory implications of doing that. Less because you would expect governments to go nuts and crack down on crypto and seize all the collateral or something, even though, I mean, that's an edge case, but it's kind of like, I mean, it really is something that applies to all crypto, and doesn't necessarily apply that much more to real world assets than to something like centralized exchanges, right? But it's really, the really big question is recourse and how to actually enforce, the claim on a real world asset that has been obtained through a liquidation. But what's happening in regulation is this regulation at the edges, right? So we see that regulators, they want to always regulate the stuff that they can get a hold of, including centralized exchanges, right? And also, when you're doing something like security tokens, regulators will often, they'll want to like regulate the token entirely, or if not that, they want very strict regulation, specifically in the issuance and redemption. And that's also something like centralized stablecoins, how they're being handled. And then one of the critical sort of approaches that everyone has to take to regulation, and it's particularly Maker more than any other project, right, is to approach regulatory exposure with the principle of diversification, right? So that in that strange edge case where you do have a government that actually cracks down on Maker and like seizes the collateral in order to just like straight up harm DAI or something like that, it's just very important to not have all your eggs in one basket, right? So that you can actually, so that the fundamental dynamics of Maker governance and the incentives built into Maker can kick in, and whatever loss ends up happening, inevitably, whenever some sort of black swan event occurs, can then be absorbed by MPR holders who can then learn from that particular lesson, right? And that governance going forward can then incorporate that into all future decision making. And then there's oh yeah, this slide is a little bit broken, but then there's like some there are real examples already of how regulation is reconciled with decentralized platforms, right? So there's traditional cryptos like Bitcoin and ETH. ETH was just declared a commodity today, right? Which is like big news, I guess, even though on the other hand, we kind of already knew that. But it's like, that's really the example of like where regulators are really happy as long as there's something they can regulate. So with Bitcoin and ETH, it's decentralized exchanges. They're happy to leave the protocol alone because they know they can't regulate it anyway. They don't want to look stupid trying to regulate something that they can't physically or whatever realistically regulate. And then also like USDC and Compound is a very cool example of like regulation interacting with DeFi and actually enabling it, right? Because when USDC is used on Compound, it really is an example of like a real world asset that provides the value for a DeFi transaction in a regulatory compliant manner. So the other big thing, other than tokenized real assets, that's going to really, drive Maker forward and allow it to scale. And tokenized real assets is specifically on the supply side, right? So that's how we can get the DAI supply to trillions of dollars, what it'll need to be at if we really want to serve the entire global economy. And synthetic assets is then how we scale on the demand side. So that's how we meet all the different types of demand and all the different types of use cases there are for both currency, but also financial services, including both, obviously, like Euro DAI and Yen DAI and Yuan DAI, and that the possibility for Maker governance to deploy other stablecoins that are pegged to all the different local currencies so that we can get closer to that future where blockchain isn't this frustrating thing you get shoved down your throat, but rather it's just like invisible on the back end of the apps you were already using, and now your fees are just lower and you don't really care about whether it's powered by Maker or by blockchain or whatever. That's totally irrelevant. The point is that things get better, and so the financial layer and DeFi delivers this like invisible service that provides better efficiency and better yields and security and so on. And also, there's of course also be synthetic assets that are pegged to anything else, so like synthetic gold and so on. And it's all the same code base, so it's all actually for Maker, it's all the MCD code base that can just be reused again and again and again. So it's just governance, basically like doing the same thing over and over, basically deploying a new MCD stack every single time. And then hooking it up to the single governance system. And what's really cool is also how we can really consolidate liquidity through synthetic assets, right? So like a really interesting example is if you look at something like, if you look at financial markets today, they're totally fragmented, right? But still quite efficient, but still also fragmented. And then if you think about how tokenized real assets will play out, especially in the context of how they would be included in Maker, you quickly can imagine something like, let's say, 60 different gold tokens from all over the world and different like storage facilities and jurisdictions and sort of type of gold and so on, right? And that the problem is that fragmentation still exists, even though the blockchain, of course, creates a tremendous level of seamless interaction between all those different forms of tokenized gold. And then a synthetic gold could very easily include all of these different gold tokens as collateral, alongside DAI and all sorts of other types of collateral, but specifically also have a significant exposure to tokenized gold. And that way it kind of gets this liquidity and this like the connection to real world gold that the tokenized assets have. But it actually creates a focal point where the liquidity can really like accumulate for gold specifically. And then in the end, that results in a very easy to use asset for like regular people, where they can just use the synthetic gold and they actually end up like not relying on some like unstable, kind of like unknown, opaque paper gold type of thing, which is what people often are afraid of with synthetic assets, right? But because of the inherent transparency of Maker and the lofty aspirations of Maker governance towards a more sound form of risk management, it'll be possible for users to trust the fact that this synthetic asset, I mean, if they actually spent the time, they could audit that, yes, there's real gold. Primarily, it's based around this like diversified exposure to real gold all over the world, as well as like a very sound, strong and diversified portfolio that sort of as a whole generates this synthetic asset that then gives a good exposure to gold. And so with tokenized real world assets providing the supply side scaling, and then synthetic assets providing the demand side scaling, we really have like both sides of the coin in how we take DAI from where it is today and DeFi where it is today, which is like where clearly the potential is there, and all sort of the fundamental assumptions around the technology and how you can build and how you can facilitate innovation, that all exists, and now we just have to scale it. And using these two, different sides of the same coin in terms of how we both access existing financial infrastructure and financial value in the real world today, as well as like bring, this whole new generation of services and types of financial products out in the real world for people to use. We can use both of these things to then actually scale it decisively, right, and exponentially, and then cross a chasm and actually make sure that Maker does end up impacting the real world and delivering on, the promise of DeFi and blockchain and even Bitcoin, right, like digital cash that anyone can use that can help people get a bank account if they're currently shut out of the financial system or escape inflation and all of that good stuff. And then this is a low-res version of the new MCD logo, or the new DAI logo, as we should call it. So it's a really big step that we can, we now know when DAI will be ready to go, because that's when we can really like get past this initial phase where the project was still being built, and into a new phase where DAI is already done, and now it's up to governance to kind of run it and meet these new opportunities that exist out there and that are happening already, like the trends that are emerging in the blockchain space and that Maker is so well positioned to play into and take advantage of, and then scale immensely through that. So that was sort of an alternate version of the same talk I did at DevCon. So, and since it hasn't, I don't think it's been released yet, you all got to have an early sneak peek. And if there's any specific questions for any of this stuff, then I'd be happy to discuss it in more detail.
All right, thanks for that, Rune. There's one comment in the sidebar. I don't know how long it was, if you wanted to read that out or whether that was just an observation.
I can do, yeah. So just saying on the point of there being multiple synth versions of MCD deployed, all with the same governance system. It sounds kind of like a terrifying amount of governance in terms of MCD is already going to be fairly huge and fairly complex, and adding multiple things on top of that is going to be a lot, I think.
Well, yeah, I agree completely, and I think that we all have this understanding that governance right now is in a completely nascent state. I've been having a lot of conversations about governance in general. It seems to be a hot topic at this DevCon, actually. It is a hot topic. It's all governance in DAOs and how do we manage the things that we've built. There's obviously not a point-by-point roadmap of what governance was going to look like over the next 6 to 12 to 18 months, because I think that as a group, we've all internalized the fact that we need to blaze some trails as we go along. There is no specific plan about how this is going to look, but I'm confident, based on the historical record, that we're going to be able to iterate and accommodate the additional complexity. We're about to have a crash course actually in the next 2 or 3 months about how to get this thing bootstrapped. But as it becomes more complex, we'll bring more resources online, more processes. It's going to be a learning experience. I don't have anything more concrete than that to add, though. It is intimidating.
Yeah, I want to say that the only, like, obviously what it requires is the risk teams, right? And that's what we need that kind of infrastructure for, because for the MKR holder perspective, it'll never, like, as any particular member of the governance community will never be able to actually fully understand every single piece of, like, all the different verticals and all the different types of collateral that have been onboarded and adjusted and so on. But plenty of people will likely be able to, like, look into some specific area that they have some sort of understanding about, right? But then more importantly, the broad governance process, right, and the decentralized governance with all the MKR holders and all the sort of the active participants will be about properly, like, sanity checking what the risk teams are coming out with, right? And even, like, meta level management, right? So the risk teams and making sure that they're sort of working efficiently and so on, right? And through that, getting the advice and getting sort of the data and the input that governance needs to then be able to make these extremely complex decisions, but still at a very high level, which ultimately, I mean, comes down to then the principle of diversification, right? That, like, as long as the basic, like, as long as governance is able to, like, rely, like, not put all our eggs in one basket and rely on enough different sort of streams of growth, and then we basically, we can feel confident and we can accept the fact that there will be failures on the way, right? There will be, like, times where something falls through, but that's simply part of the model, right? Because the way we don't try to kind of, like, somehow prevent that from happening and somehow try to, like, engineer away risk or something like that. We just have to simply like, be realistic about it, right? And then be diverse and kind of solve it.
As the process matures, we start bringing more and more teams online as well. Currently, we have the interim governance facilitator, we have the interim risk teams, and as the community and the foundation continues to release empowered actors into the ecosystem, we're going to have more and more teams of dedicated individuals taking on separate aspects of the ecosystem as well. So it's not just going to be the people in this room or the people that we're also familiar with. It's the ecosystem, the governance ecosystem will be expanding significantly over the course of the next few months. Akiva, you had a question? Did you want to ask that?
Yeah, I know there's been talk about moving collateral outside of, like, or moving it away from being concentrated in one jurisdiction, but I'm wondering if there's also been work around getting it away from U.S. allied jurisdictions. Like, I mean, I'm wondering if maybe Russia would be a good place to bring on collateral or their allies.
That's an interesting question. It's a sort of regulatory arbitrage kind of question. Is that what you mean?
Well, the concern is that the U.S. would use their power and influence to get their allies to seize collateral unfairly, and I'm wondering how that can be mitigated.
Well, Rune, that kind of ties back to an interesting thread I saw you engaged with recently about the relative risks between government intervention versus just regular SPVs failing and or behaving incorrectly. So how much of a risk do you see this sort of bugbear of the US shutting something down? Is that a realistic option? And if so, are we looking to other jurisdictions to diversify?
So I generally think that the more critical thing to do, because it's true, there's kind of like the geopolitical landscape of the world. But I think, like, initially that what we've got to sort of hold on to, that I think is, like, a very reasonable and sort of reliable type of stability, is the rule of law, right? So I think really focusing on diversifying across the many different countries that have very strong, like strong track record on rule of law and property rights. That's gonna, like that is, I see that as being like relatively less risky, having like less of sort of that more outlier black swan type of risk. And that's generally the big, like the the downside I think there are with some of the obvious kind of like doing sort of the obvious geopolitical diversification, where you then try to focus on on like China and Russia, right? Like in particular those two jurisdictions, right? They obviously are like very opposed to the US, for instance, right? And you could imagine a scenario where like a crackdown by the US would then, to some extent, like somehow would like be seen then in sort of there by the rivals of the US as this is a project to support, right? So if Collateral was actually cracked down on in the US, you could reasonably imagine that then in China, they would then think, okay, since America doesn't like this project or whatever, what's going on here, then maybe it's something for us to support some more. But and I think that's certainly like a valid point, right? And like a valid part of like the way to think about sort of the very large, like very holistic, very like top level idea of how to, like the direction that Maker should take. But I just think that a much greater type of sort of the crackdown risk is really like the ability, like the ease with which a government could suspend property rights, right? And just like arbitrarily basically do such a crackdown at all. Because even though, I mean, obviously, well, like most countries, right, and even in the West, right, and especially the US, right, are very notorious for like all sorts of activity in the end, right, that like the government does for, justified by whatever reasons, right? The core of the economies, especially in the US and in Europe, right, in the West in general, they entirely like function on, it's like this private economy that entirely functions based on property rights and like private business to a very large extent. That fundamentally, right, relies on the fact that they're almost like, I mean, it's almost like that every corporation is like a mini government that is able to use a legal system in all sorts of very like strong ways that they can really rely on this. Like this infrastructure is fundamental for the economy to even work at all. So what that means is that it's very, very expensive for a country like that to start causing doubts about the property rights, right, and about the rule of law. And whereas if you look at, like in particular, Russia and China, right, those countries don't really, like their economies aren't set up like that at all. So they're like based around like state-owned enterprises, right? And they're based around kind of like this like singular type of legal construct, which, I mean, and like China is literally communist, right? So that actually means that like the state is actually below the party, right? And so the Communist Party can literally like make any arbitrary decision, and that sort of automatically is above any type of law. And that's like the foundation of Marxist Leninism, right? That like the party is like above everything else. And so what that means is that it's just not nearly as expensive for let's say like China giving regulatory approval or whatever, right? I mean, whatever, just like any country that has an economy that's set up like this, giving regulatory approval at one point in time, and then just like completely dismissing any sort of initial kind of like certainty that Maker governance had around this being actually a very reliable guarantee, because it happens quite often that there's this kind of that like there's one sort of one order of business, and then because for whatever reason, suddenly your business has been, the state has bought your business for this amount of money or whatever, right? And that actually happens quite often in these types of economies, right? Because they don't really lose anything from it, because there's really no expectation in the first place that there is like a very stable rule of law. So anyway, so like my point is that I think that like that sort of incentive and sort of like the cost of doing a crackdown is something that really should be considered when we decide how it's best to allocate the exposure of the collateral portfolio. So the unicorns, right, are really like the really, really incredibly important places to look at are neutral or like not, geopolitically not very aligned countries that still have very strong property rights and rule of law. And in particular, Singapore, I think, is like a really, really great example, right? That's like a very interesting jurisdiction that does have this very strong business-friendly, like private business-friendly track record, but at the same time isn't really in the like that much geopolitically in the American sphere of influence. And I mean, and there are other examples as well, but Singapore, I think, is like one of the best right now. And ultimately, as always, I mean, you always want to diversify in all cases, right? So even if we think that, let's say, Russia is very risky and they could totally crack down on, if they feel like for whatever reason, if there's a political decision and that's time to, now we don't like the fact that there's collateral, that we just don't like DAI, so we want to punish it however we can, try to harm it however we can, and then there's a crackdown on collateral. Like even if that's a realistic scenario for like Russia, Russia, like for collateral that relies on the Russian legal system, there's still some amount of exposure that it makes sense to have to that jurisdiction, regardless, right? Like there's always some level of exposure to almost any type of sort of jurisdiction or particular like situation setup that makes sense, and that in the grand scheme of things, like in the context of the overall portfolio, reduces the overall risk.
All right, thanks for that, Akiva. Renat, you had a question. Did you want to read that out, or should I?
Yes. Hi, everyone. Working with one candidate for multi-collateral DAI accounts receivables in the past 6 months. The collateral is in the US, and with US going towards the negative interest rate territory, there is probably, let's say, 50% chance that will happen. The rates which traditional lenders use to offer and price their products is based on the Fed rate, and effectively, if right now we're talking about 2 to 7% range for the capital cost of capital from traditional sources. If it goes down further by 1 or 2 or 3 percentage points, it might be very hard to attract such collateral into multi-collateral DAI, because the various risks that are added when this collateral is tokenized and dealt with, and incentives that are necessary to attract a good amount of bidders in on-chain auctions, effectively could price certain collaterals out of MCD, where collateral is originates from jurisdictions which have extremely low cost of capital. So the question is, what might be the possible steps, milestones, and prerequisites for multi-collateral DAI system to launch a stablecoin that is pegged to a currency other than the US dollar? For example, in Argentina, the borrowers use real estate to borrow, and they are paying exorbitant interest rate, because traditionally how the lending, secured lending works is that the real cost for the borrower is the federal rate of borrowing, right, of that currency, plus a spread of an intermediary of a bank or originator. So in such jurisdictions where the borrowers pay, instead of, let's say, compared to US or Europe, where they pay 10, 20, 30, 50, 70% annually. I feel that it's an amazing opportunity for multi-collateral DAI to demonstrate that there is no reason why someone with a stable asset such as real estate has to pay 70% interest rate just because the entire economy of Argentina is going through this cycle. So the question is, what may be the possible steps, milestones, and prerequisites for this to happen? How far are we away from being able to even attempt such a feat, and what kind of building blocks must be there before we actually should even consider working on it?
Sorry, what's the question exactly? Like how to do a new currency or how to onboard?
Yeah, the question is, what are the possible prerequisites, building blocks that are necessary in order to even consider working on adding a stable coin such as DAI, but the one that will be pegged to, let's say, Argentinian peso instead of US dollar, to capture the demand from and the imbalance, the very high cost of capital in borrowing for in these countries with collateral that is stable. And
yeah, right. So, I mean, what's interesting is that what I'm mostly seeing from like the Argentinian community is that they really do not want anything to do with their own currency, right? So they really just want to like switch over to the dollar, and that's why DAI is having this like organic demand to some extent happening in Argentina. But I can talk. I mean, so the plans for like synthetic assets aren't like finalized at this point, right? And they're not really a priority yet because obviously we got to launch MCD first and so on. But like I said earlier, it's actually as simple as deploying the same, like the same technical stack that's gonna be deployed when MCD launches. So the goal is to get maker governance, like get the DAO as a whole to the point where everything is in place so that governance can like pay for smart contract teams that are completely decentralized, right? That are independent and then work directly for the DAO and are able to like efficiently facilitate deploying new synthetic assets. And then it's up to, once that's in place, then it's very easy up to the governance process, like prioritizing which order new assets should get, taking into account obviously the whole concern around complexity, right? That obviously you can't just go totally crazy and onboard 100 new currencies in one day.
Thanks.
I'm actually going to put you on the spot. I probably shouldn't do this, but so do we have a rough timeline? Is there, if you had to guess when synthetic assets would be something that will address in governance, when do you think that would be? Roughly this year, next year, year after?
I think, I mean, yeah, I can't really answer that because from what I know about the tech, it really shouldn't be that. Like, it is we're surprisingly close to being able to do it, but I guess it's really a matter of priority. And I think actually I would imagine that the big blocker really is governance. Like, so it will be, like just even like dealing with the migration and actually getting into like a stable equilibrium, and then then we have to deal with new collateral types and figuring that out, right, and getting into sort of a comfortable pace with that. And then at that point, assuming that there's no unknown technical things that have to sort of really be in place. And there are a few small things that the foundation still thinks that should be added after MCD launch, and these will actually all these will crucially there was Charles from the foundation. He actually did a talk on this, on the concept of improvement proposals, right? And so basically there's like some early thinking being done around how to do maker improvement proposals, right? So that there will be a framework around how to add new stuff to the system once that it's live, right? And so the foundation, before coming out with anything and saying, here are like some things that it might make sense to add to the system, the first thing that needs to be established is the entire like framework and sort of the documentation requirements and the documentation framework, especially, right, for like adding some new technical component to the system. And then only once that's in place, then the foundation and anyone else will be able to go through that process to then propose specific minor changes to the system. And ultimately then also that process will then be able to facilitate the synthetic assets once the community is comfortable with it.
Rune, something you said there was really interesting. I just wanted to point it out, is that maybe like the friction for adding collaterals to the different branches of MCD that would have like a peso or like maybe more realistically a euro, wouldn't you just be able to kind of proxy them over, and maybe the only real difference would be like the debt ceiling, since all the sort of risk assessment was already done? You wouldn't have to like totally redo that process.
Yeah, you're talking about how to, let's say, govern a euro versus a USD pegged DAI, and how a lot of stuff can sort of like in a way act as a single collateral type, but like split across multiple synthetic assets.
Yeah, exactly. I mean, yeah, you just mentioned that one of the things you think might be a friction is the overhead of adding collaterals to different sort of synthetic asset portfolio bases, if that's like a right way of saying it. Yeah.
Yeah, so I think, so this is something that there has to be a lot more thinking done on this subject, right? But I think in very basic terms, there will both be collateral types that are essentially have the same risk regardless of what asset you're generating with them. And an example of that would be like crypto or like stocks or something like that. But then when you get to something like, let's say, bonds, like government bonds in particular, right? Like there's a big difference between risk parameters for T-bills backing a US dollar denominated coin, right? And then using T-bills to back a euro, right? And same for like German government bonds or something like that, right? And even more extremely would be stable coins, right? So obviously there's a big difference between generating euro DAI with a euro stablecoin versus generating euro DAI with a USD stablecoin in terms of the risk of like a liquidation and so on.
Yeah, thanks. That's a really great point.
You also touched on something that I thought was very interesting, at least relevant for this group too, is that now that a launch date has been set, or at least publicly revealed, it lends some more weight to my constant repetition that governance is about to start in earnest, and we have lots and lots of work to do. And you mentioned migration, and we have 5 or 6 governance calls before launch, and so that means that there's a significant amount of work to do, and that's going to be the theme of these next rounds of calls: is how do we migrate the ecosystem from a single collateral world to a multi-collateral world. There's going to be a lot of really interesting things to talk about and a lot of really interesting work to do too. But let's probably not get into that today, considering it's approaching 2 o'clock in the morning local time, and we still need to talk about the peg. So thank you, Rune, for your presentation. That was great. Thanks for staying up so late, because I know that you're probably one of the most popular people at DevCon this year, so I appreciate that. Vishesh, are you on the call?
I am.
Did you want to give us a state of the peg?
Sure. I will try to make it snappy as well. I know it's very late in Japan. Okay, so I think most of the people have been following, but I'll just recap anyway. So one thing that's been interesting lately is watching the DAI supply. So since that dip just at the end of September, it's been coming up fairly consistently to about 81 million as of a few days ago. And then just in the last couple days, we saw, a couple of very large draws, pulling out, say, an additional 3.5 million in DAI, bringing the supply up to a little over 85 million recently. So those are positive indicators, I think. And given all the buzz and the appreciation of maker price, et cetera, it seems that there is a renewed sort of sense of positivity. May have something to do with the multi-collateral announcements, may just generally be market conditions, often hard to parse those things out. As far as the collateral side, so what was interesting was around that same time frame, we talked about a bit more collateral being added to the system as an apparent risk hedge. Then it was fairly quiet, and then there was actually a bit of circulation, so some more collateral was added, some more collateral was removed. And then again in that same time frame, along with that additional increase in supply, some more collateral was added, which is a fairly sort of expected reaction, because there's sort of that equilibrium risk level that people are comfortable with maintaining. So as more DAI is drawn out, they will then put in some more collateral as well to maintain those relative collateralization ratios. Bytefront has been fairly quiet recently, obviously because ETH price has been somewhat steady and even appreciating a bit lately. The DAI price, so just to touch on this, again, fairly steady. The trading volume on DEX is roughly 4 million, which is a little bit stronger than normal. I think the normal lately has been 1 to 2 million a day. And in the last 24 hours, it's been about 4, again, with that very solid, slightly above $1 weighted average price. You can see the spread is very little below $1 and sort of spread out a bit more over $1. So that's I think a pretty healthy curve for the peg. So I think the state of the peg is good, is the general synthesis. And then that same curve holding steady over the 7-day time frame as well, with roughly 16 million in trading volume, which is again a little over 2 million per day. So last 24 hours was a bit on the higher end of that. Again, you see like microstructures, so Oasis holding a pretty normal curve with a bit of a skew. Coinbase pretty much more centered in the weighted average territory. Uniswap spread pretty evenly all throughout, and sort of dominating some of the higher and lower end prices. So yeah, I mean, these are generally good curves for the peg, and I think pretty consistent with what we've been seeing lately over the longer time scale. As far as what's been going on with secondary lending platforms, so again, this has been a pretty interesting state recently since the stability fee was dropped to 10.5%, because that borrow rate has actually been more expensive generally on Compound, holding at roughly 12%. So this was sort of a curious state that we discussed a few months back, I believe it was, with regards to the Compound borrow rate being more expensive than the Maker borrow rate, generally incentivizing people to switch over and refinance to Maker, though it seems new positions have been drawn out for Maker. The borrow volume for Compound since that initial hit has actually just been kind of steady lately. So we haven't really seen like that 3.5 million chunk didn't really come out of Compound per se. And it was sort of legitimately the overall DAI lending pie kind of grew a little bit, which is appropriate since it kind of shrank a little bit a few months ago. So seems maybe some of that latent interest coming back, so potentially a positive indicator. As far as what's been going on with supply, so Again, fairly steady, maybe a little bit of a slight rise in activity lately, but overall not a huge change. Roughly 49-ish million lent on DYDX and Compound versus just before the stability fee drop, roughly 45. So tops at 10%, slightly less than 10% change. As far as the excess supply, so that again took a little bit of a hit with some of those position closures, but then has come up a little bit more recently because again, supply has increased a little bit, borrow has not changed much, therefore excess supply has a slight increase, which is the converse of the utilization rate. So DYDX utilization rate, again, generally very unpredictable thing, was a bit higher recently and has come down a little bit just in the last 24 hours. Compound took a huge hit during September and then was kind of steady for the beginning of the month. And utilization has taken a little bit of a dip in the last couple of days just through that renewed supply. So it's been interesting to actually look at one of the graphs I wanted to double and click into was network activity. So Sentiment had a really good graph for this. The transaction volume. So this transaction volume is something that I've been keeping an eye on. We saw some spikes again in end of 2018, a bit of a general sustained increase throughout the beginning of this year into the summer, a little bit of a dip with some of that dip in activity in going into August, and then a few spikes in September and another spike again just in the last few days with some of that increased interest. Again, I think primarily driven through a lot of smart contract usage in moving positions around, increasing positions, etc. But this will be interesting to watch whether we see an actual sustained increase of transaction volume going into October or not, because I think that'll be a pretty solid reinforcing indicator of general sentiment and usage of Maker and DAI. But I would not be very surprised. This is just number of transactions versus sort of value weighted. But I would not be surprised if this continues a sustained pattern into October, and that'll be, I think, a really positive indicator if it does. Okay, so I said I would keep it short and snappy. That was a brief version today since it's very late and we're going over the hour already.
All right, thanks, Vishesh. That was great. It is the top of the hour, so I want to thank everybody that everybody local that stayed up late, everybody else that stayed up or probably ducked out of their meetings and or their day jobs to join us today. This was great. Thank you, Rune, for your presentation. We're going to stick around for, sorry, Florian, we're going to get to your question in a second. We're going to stick around for a general Q&A, brief Q&A, I hope. And then if people have any additional questions, the conversation, as always, continues in the forums. Please join us there and or in the chat, or if you want to interact with us in real time. All right, thanks, everybody. Cyrus, are you still on the call? Can you address a collateral-related question for us?
Sure.
Florian, do you have access to a microphone, or should we read that out for you?
Yeah. No, hi. This is Florian here from Berlin. Thank you, everyone, for this great call. I had a few questions. We just applied as a collateral for the MCD system. We've opened a thread in the, I think, appropriate parts of the Maker forum. And I think we have filled out all the questions in the forum. And I have two questions now. One is, what is the process from here? Once that we have made this forum post, how does it continue? What is going to happen? And second, given the fact that we are applying as a regulated security token, is there any experience on that particular process from the Maker side? And what can we do from our end to kind of facilitate this?
Sure. So The process from here is after MCD launches and we kind of go through migration and we cover a few collateral types from the initial collateral set because those were the original ones that were audited by the technical review team. At that point, our risk team or potentially some other independent risk team can start basically picking up applications from the forum and start evaluating them, either using our risk models as templates or potentially if they want to, they can create their own risk models and submit evaluations for the community to review. But essentially the answer is just whenever a risk team gets around to it. And it will, at the very minimum, have to be obviously after MCD launch and kind of a few operational details that need to occur after launch first. In terms of security tokens, yeah, that's an interesting question. One thing that's likely to be critical there is to have some sort of legal focused review, some sort of legal risk team per se. And that's something that we are working to facilitate the creation or uptake of those types of specialists. Because obviously that's not something for just kind of standard risk analysts to work on. So depending on what the structure is for your security token and kind of the issuance format, there should be a review there as well.
Cyrus, I have a quick clarification question. So you said that the next step, I think I missed the very beginning of your answer, but you said that the next step was that eventually a risk team would get to it. I'm not sure, did you mention the asset priority poll? And just wanted to get clarification about whether risk teams work on stuff outside of the asset priority poll.
Yeah, so the asset priority poll is something I kind of skipped over, which is part of the process. But that priority poll isn't locked, isn't set in stone. Risk teams have the freedom to kind of evaluate what they want, but that's kind of more guidance towards what the community is most interested in, and which is kind of most likely to be, impactful for the maker community.
Is there any, because Rune talked a lot about tokenized real assets, is there any particular priority inside Maker or in the community with regards to tokenized real assets as opposed to crypto coins?
Yeah, so I mean, there's kind of two aspects to it. One is evaluating the risk of the underlying asset, and these are kind of standard models that we can explore over the coming months. But then there's obviously the second critical factor, which is the issuance and regulatory side of things. So yeah, I think those are kind of the two pieces of the puzzle there. So
makes sense.
Yeah, I think when Rune references those real assets, he certainly intends that both of those bases are covered, and we intend to.
Okay. Regarding these risk teams, which will do this analysis on behalf of the community, are they all, so to speak, in-house from the Maker team, or do you work with external experts? And is there anything we can do to facilitate that, since we, we built a security token, we wrote a prospectus, got it approved by the Financial Market Authority, and bring a certain level of expertise? Is there anything that we can contribute, not only for our review, but generally for reviews of security tokens that would help the Maker community to make better decisions on that end?
Right. So a couple months ago, we published piece on risk teams and how we might envision them to operate. I just posted a link in the chat. Short answer is that, yeah, we're going to need to have external risk teams because it's not feasible for our in-house risk team to handle the entirety of MCD. It's not practical, it's not desirable. And part of the original vision has always been this network of independent, decentralized, distributed risk teams that all kind of attack areas that they're experts in. So depending on what your security token is specifically, either it's something that we could do in-house if it made sense, or if you reach out to me outside of this call, we can kind of collaborate to help source some independent external risk team that can take this on.
Perfect. Then just one last question. What is currently the target launch date for MCD?
Oh, I think it's November 18th.
All right, perfect. Thank you, Cyrus. I will reach out to you. How can I, do you have an email, or what's the best way to get in touch with you directly?
Yeah, I'll post my email in the chat.
Thank you.
I just have a few comments also on this. So, like, first of all, I think that for security tokens in general, we should expect that it'll take there's a lot of technical overhead in supporting things like whitelists and like backdoors and that kind of stuff, because the Maker protocol doesn't natively support that, and you need to kind of build this entire extra adapter. Like, you need to be very specialized and advanced adapters for that kind of stuff, and that's going to be one of the really big hurdles towards onboarding a lot of security tokens. So that's just like that's what I would expect in general. That's going to be like one of the really big things that are going to impact the timeline for real world assets.
Yeah.
But then, so for this, Florian, so for this your specific asset, right? And so I mean, because I've been looking into this before, right? And so as I understand it, like, you guys can actually issue this as a regular ERC20 because of something like you're able to like waive like the civil law or something, the civil law requirements of the security. So from a financial regulatory standpoint, it is still a security. And I think there's one major concern, and that needs to be like figured out, and that is like how to basically deal with the situation where I mean, okay, so like, because my understanding is then what that basically means is that when you redeem the token, like when the token actually is redeemed for the underlying, at that point in time, there has to be this quite strict compliance process being done. And if it then turns out that there's been some sort of crime, or there's some sort of like issue basically with the token, that whatever, it's been used for money laundering or whatever issue has happened sort of like somewhere down the line before it was redeemed, then that can actually impact the value of the token. And by implication, that means that you don't necessarily, or like, just because you have a token on the blockchain, that is not always a guarantee that that token actually does have a valid legal claim. And the way I imagine you solve that, most of like in general terms, would be you sort of on an off-chain basis, you prove the chain of custody, right? So you prove that, look, I got this token from someone who got it from someone that ultimately got it from the issuer, and I can prove that all of those transactions were above board, and it all make, I know that they all are like, none of them are doing money laundering or anything like that. But anyway, so the point is that I think that, well, so first of all, is that correct? Or did I miss something fundamental there?
Thank you, Rune, for these concerns. So when it comes to the whitelist, we don't have a whitelist on the token level. So there is, this is why in our application we said that we conform with the gem join die credit system adapter. I was told this is like the standard adapter. And since we don't have a whitelist or anything at all, I feel that since we're normal ERC20, we comply with this adapter. And when it comes to the redeemability of the token, we don't plan and we don't legally understand that we have to enforce any analysis of the chain of custody of the token over its lifetime once we redeem its base value, but rather the worst case that we have to do is that when you want to redeem the token at the end of the lifetime of the term of the fund, that you have to do a KYC with us if the account on which these tokens are being held has not been KYC'd before. And that KYC process would involve the owner of that address to do potentially a video ident procedure with us. And if that person is not on the blacklist, then we could service that person, meaning we could redeem the euro equivalent of that token. And our blacklist currently consists of US citizens, Australians, Iranians, and I think that's it. So there is a certain chance that a token holder who wants to redeem cannot redeem it. In that case, that token holder would be recommended to sell the token on the secondary market to someone who can redeem it.
Yeah, I mean, and I see how that's like, that's the general structure. I mean, I think this is like this does look like a really ideal and very, very interesting structure. But basically, I still think that it really, like, the edge cases really have to be considered where, you know, what if it can be proven that it's been used for terrorism financing or something like that, right? Because there's no checks on it that can, like any other cryptocurrency, right? In general, that can happen. And like I've definitely run into, there's definitely like, you know, there are situations kind of like a lot of like there's projects doing this kind of stuff and that have these kind of tokens in other situations where basically you do end up in like a scenario where you want to be really careful that that's something that relies on legal links. You really need to be very careful about being very clean, you know what I mean? And so basically what I'm saying is that I think that, so whether or not that is actually a concern that ultimately, you know, that becomes serious enough that if, for instance, let's say it would have a big impact on what kind of risk parameters that could be given to this kind of asset. Whether or not that's the case, because of course that's impossible for me to say, and that would require like a proper legal risk analysis, right? And which is a part of the whole. That's kind of the process we're trying to set up, right? So there's as an asset goes through the onboarding, there will actually be, you know, and there even will once Maker Governance is ready for it, Maker Governance will even pick these like a DAO team, right? Like a decentralized team that is directly employed by Maker to then actually do this kind of legal risk analysis. But so if we assume that it turns out that there is actually like this kind of like an actual edge case situation where tokens become implicated in some sort of crime, or for whatever reason it turns out that there's actually, like, it's not desirable to get you know, tokens that are ultimately based on legal claim into a CDP, but where they might have been involved in something that is against the laws where the claim is supposed to be exercised. Then one solution would be to then basically build a KYC, or kind of like a compliance layer for that particular, like just for specifically the point where it's used in a CDP. So that when the asset enters the CDP, there is a check done to make sure, can we actually see that there's a very clear, you know, like above board compliance, or, you know, there's no crime has been committed or whatever, right? Like based on really like best effort. before it enters the CDP, so that we can feel very secure that the DAI that's being generated out of this isn't going to suddenly become invalid or like insolvent because it turns out that due to some issue the legal claim is no longer as strong. And ultimately, this is a kind of question that, in the end, it's not really like black or white, right? Because you can it's always a risk decision by the MPR holders, but it's possible that it impacts ultimately the risk parameters, right? So it could be something like the stability fee depends on this, or the debt ceiling depends on this. And I think for me, like immediately, that's what I thought when I've been looking at you guys as it. That's really what I think is like one of the big things that has to be really drilled into, and that's going to be the big question for governance.
Cool. Thank you, Rune. We're happy to have these discussions with the risk team, and also very looking forward to kind of just maybe set up a general kind of framework for other security tokens to come around these questions. I think they are very important to be answered. Thank you.
So Rune, I have a quick question related to just the governance roadmap. So I know we released the roadmap on our website, and it covers like several votes that have to happen before like the real launch. For example, like DSR, initial values, the collateral inclusion poll, and then in general, kind of like the risk assessment of the initial collaterals and like all of their tunable parameters, which also includes stuff like auction parameters. Do you, with the November 18th launch date, is it, I guess my question is, how much of this needs to be really solidified before that launch date has to happen, and does it have to launch with like everything solidified?
Yeah, so I mean, basically the basic thinking, right, is that the launch of MCD is obviously not going to be, I mean, I think it will be, MCD will absolutely be very functional, and like then the ecosystem will quickly switch over to the new DAI, and there'll be, the DAI savings rate and all of these cool new features will be available immediately. But at the same time, when you look at it sort of from the broader governance perspective, that it'll take a long time for things to really get up and running, right? And I think, so there's basically, there are like in fact, governance will always have to, in terms of like how kind of like things get up and running, right? In terms of how the community and how the governance process really like takes full sort of conscious control over every aspect of the system, and really like has a proper rationale for every single decision and every single, ultimately parameter in the system. There has to be a very clear prioritization about what are the most important parts to get to this very rational point as quickly as possible, right? And in the very beginning, I think that clearly, like obviously the priority has to be just the migration itself. And that's really the big challenge, is like just how do we even securely launch MCD at all, right? And that's also a situation where we actually want to do that sooner rather than later, because as the bigger the ecosystem grows, the bigger of a challenge it is to do the upgrade, right? And then of course there's also just, I mean, there are like the very, there's like the very critical base risk parameters, right? Like debt ceiling, liquidation ratio, stability fees for the different collateral types. And then with MCD, there's even immediately like new complexity, like multiple CDP types within a single collateral type, right? But there are actually tons of smaller parameters in the system, including all the auction stuff. And the idea is basically that the foundation will just like propose basically interim values for all of these things, right? And then the community can scrutinize those, and ultimately, there might be specific points where there, it's actually possible to like quite easily formulate like a rational argument for for a particular change that actually is like, that works from a we can get sort of this rational consensus around quite easily. But I think there's because it's already very difficult to wrap your head around governance of the major parameters like stability fee and versus liquidation ratio, then I think in general that it's important that governance doesn't get too distracted by the smaller details, right, and rather gets the bigger things right at first, and then as there's sort of the bandwidth is there, we can increasingly explore kind of like getting the frameworks in place for how to pick the more like the smaller of the variables in the system. And in general, I mean, in fact, this is not even a dynamic that's just like that's like unique to launch, right? Like the system will always be in flux, and there'll always be this need to like constantly think about, are we actually setting these various parameters correctly? And ultimately, this sort of goes back to the general perspective on how governance has to ultimately view the system, right? Is that it'll never be possible to have all of these things be perfect, right? And in the end, oftentimes it is about like prioritization and then ensuring that on a whole we have the diversification we need, and we have sort of the ability to grow even if there are like things that aren't set perfectly, so that like things, so that it turns out that there are mistakes that governance can then learn from. That is actually a part of the evolutionary process, right? And not something to kind of like try to avoid at all costs, and through that prioritize in the wrong way so that we forget sort of the bigger picture and the really important things.
Nice. Thank you. I think that's totally reasonable. And yeah, thanks for the answer.
All right, I think this might be a good place to stop. It's half past the hour. Thanks again, Rune, for the presentation. Thanks, everybody, for your great questions. I also want to thank you, Florian, for joining the call. I think that was an interesting milestone for us to have a collateral partner come in and ask some questions. So that was great. As I said earlier, please continue the conversation in the forums. That's where governance happens in earnest, and that's where the deep debates are occurring. So please, if we didn't get a chance to address your question, ask it there, and we'll take a look at it over the course of the next week. And that's it for us. Thank you again, everybody.
Thank you, everybody.
See you guys.
Bye, everyone.